It didn't come with fireworks. No press conference, no breaking news banner screaming across the bottom of the screen. But make no mistake, what just happened in Cleveland may end up mattering more than a draft pick, a blockbuster trade, or any free agent splash this franchise has made in years. Because this wasn't just an interview, it was a quiet admission that the old way hasn't worked, and that the future might require something radically different. A 30-year-old offensive coordinator, once sleeping in his car while chasing coaching opportunities, sat across from the decision-makers of the Cleveland Browns. On paper, it looks routine. Young coach, open position, standard league procedure. But context changes everything. For a franchise long defined by instability, impulse decisions, and quarterback chaos, this single meeting represented something they've almost never done. Pause, zoom out, and think structurally. That's why the name Grant Udinski is suddenly everywhere. Not because he's a celebrity coach, not because he brings instant hype, but because his entire football identity runs counter to the Browns' historical instincts. His rise didn't come from pedigree or press tours, it came from process, obsession with quarterback development, in a system-first mindset that prioritizes long-term coherence over short-term noise. And for Cleveland, that alone is a departure worth paying attention to. The interview didn't signal desperation. That's what makes it unsettling in a good way. This didn't feel like a team chasing a savior or selling hope. It felt like an organization testing a new internal question. What if the problem isn't talent? What if it's architecture? For years, the Browns have treated fixes as isolated moves. Draft a quarterback, fire a coach, install a new system, start over. But this meeting hinted at something much deeper, a willingness to rethink how everything connects. Udinski arrives from the Jacksonville Jaguars, but the appeal isn't where he's from, it's what he represents. His offenses aren't static, they're living systems designed around the quarterback, built to evolve in real time, and supported by technology, psychology, and tempo. That matters in a league where young quarterbacks are burning out faster than ever, not because they lack skill, but because they're dropped into environments that weren't designed to support growth. And that's where this interview quietly collided with a much larger conversation happening across the NFL. Quarterbacks are no longer evaluating teams the way they used to. The new generation cares less about logos and legacy and more about infrastructure, less about fame and more about fit. And no one embodies that shift more clearly than Shedeur Sanders, a player who has been unusually vocal about valuing development, stability, and functional leadership over glamour or market size. This isn't to say the Browns are chasing Sanders, that's too simple, and honestly not the point. This is about alignment, about awareness, about whether Cleveland finally understands that elite quarterbacks don't want to be dropped into chaos and asked to save it. They want to walk into systems that already make sense. And by even engaging with someone like Udinski, the Browns signaled, intentionally or not, that they're aware of how closely they're being watched. What made this interview powerful wasn't what was promised, it was what was implied. Cleveland wasn't shopping for a headline, they weren't selling optimism. They were exploring whether a philosophy rooted in patience, structure, and quarterback-first thinking could finally replace years of reactive decision-making. That alone reframes this moment from off-season trivia to a genuine crossroads. Because if this interview means what it looks like it means, then the Browns aren't chasing relevance anymore. They're testing credibility. They're asking whether they're ready to stop acting like a franchise in survival mode and start behaving like one with an actual plan. And the rest of the league, players, coaches, agents, fans, they noticed. Not because Cleveland said something bold, but because for once, they did something different. And that's why this conversation doesn't end with one meeting, it's just beginning. What separates this candidate from every other name that typically cycles through NFL hiring conversations isn't age, buzz, or resume padding. It's orientation. Grant Udinski doesn't approach football like a caretaker of tradition. He approaches it like an engineer. Every decision starts with one question. What does the quarterback need in order to function at his highest level, consistently, under pressure? That alone is a radical departure from how many franchises still operate. Most coaches install systems first, then ask quarterbacks to survive inside them. Udinski flips that equation entirely. His offenses are not pre-packaged philosophies looking for players to execute them. They are custom-built environments designed to amplify specific traits, mobility, instincts, processing speed, without punishing players for what they aren't. In a league still struggling to adapt to dynamic, off-script quarterbacks, that mindset is currency. What also makes him different is how he got here. There was no fast track, no celebrity coaching tree, no cushy entry point. His rise was quiet, non-linear, and demanding. Years spent grinding for opportunities, studying quarterback behavior, and refining how players actually learn under stress shaped his approach far more than any playbook ever could. That background matters because it shows up in how he teaches. Players aren't expected to conform, they're expected to collaborate. Udinski doesn't believe quarterback development ends on the practice field. He treats it as a multi-layered process that blends mechanics, decision-making, emotional regulation, and situational awareness. Film study isn't just about correcting mistakes, it's about understanding patterns. Reps aren't just repetitions, they're data points. That's why his system integrates modern tools like performance tracking, simulation-based reps, and tempo manipulation. None of it is for show. It's there to reduce chaos when games speed up. This is where his philosophy becomes especially relevant to teams searching for long-term answers at quarterback. He views mobility and improvisation not as problems to be controlled, but as assets to be structured. Instead of restricting quarterbacks with rigid reads, he builds frameworks that guide instincts without killing them. That balance, freedom with boundaries, is incredibly difficult to get right, and it's why so few young quarterbacks actually thrive early in their careers. Contrast that with the traditional hiring cycle, where familiarity and comfort often outweigh fit and foresight. Safe names, proven systems, philosophies that worked 5 or 10 years ago. Udinski represents the opposite. He represents where the league is going, not where it's been. His methods reflect the modern reality of defensive speed, disguised coverages, and relentless pressure. And instead of asking quarterbacks to be perfect, he builds systems that assume chaos and teach players how to win inside it. There's also a human element that separates him from the pack. Players who've worked in similar environments often point to communication as the difference. Not authoritarian, not detached, collaborative. Quarterbacks are taught the why, not just the what. That creates buy-in, ownership, and confidence, qualities that don't show up on stat sheets but decide games in critical moments. It also creates trust, which is the foundation every successful quarterback-coach relationship is built on. This is why this candidacy feels different. It's not just about a young coach with fresh ideas. It's about a philosophy that challenges the NFL's most persistent bad habit, trying to force quarterbacks into systems instead of building systems around quarterbacks. For a franchise evaluating whether it's finally ready to break that cycle, this isn't a trendy option, it's a mirror. And once you see that difference clearly, the next question becomes impossible to ignore. If Cleveland truly understands what separates this candidate from the rest, are they willing to reshape themselves enough to support it? The hardest truth for Cleveland fans to swallow is also the simplest. The Browns' failures were never about a lack of talent, not at quarterback, not on offense, not even across the roster. The problem was context, what happened around that talent once it arrived. For decades, the Cleveland Browns didn't just miss on players, they mismanaged environments. Look back at the pattern, and it becomes impossible to ignore. Quarterbacks were drafted with optimism and expectations, only to be dropped into systems that were already cracking. Coaches came in with different philosophies, different terminology, different visions of how the offense should function. Before any young quarterback could stabilize, the ground shifted again. New coordinator, new scheme, new timeline, reset, rinse, repeat. This is how promising careers quietly die, not in one catastrophic moment, but through constant disruption. Quarterbacks were asked to learn new protections, new footwork, new reads, and new leadership expectations every year or two. Development windows collapsed before they even opened. Confidence eroded, mistakes compounded, and when the results didn't come fast enough, the organization responded the only way it knew how: panic. The Browns became reactive by habit. A bad stretch led to firings. A losing season triggered another philosophical overhaul. The front office chased solutions in isolation, fix the quarterback, then fix the coach, then fix the roster, without ever fixing how those pieces were meant to work together. Talent wasn't failing in Cleveland, talent was being exhausted. Even when flashes appeared, they were never protected. A strong stretch of games created pressure to accelerate timelines. Expectations ballooned before foundations were set. When adversity hit, there was no buffer, no shared vision to fall back on. In functional franchises, systems absorb turbulence. In Cleveland, turbulence was the system. That's why the term QB graveyard stuck, not because quarterbacks arrived broken, but because the environment broke them. Development requires patience, continuity, and alignment. Cleveland offered none of the three. Young passers were expected to elevate chaos instead of being elevated by structure. That's not leadership, that's survival mode. This is the context that makes the recent interview matter, because for the first time in a long time, Cleveland appears to be interrogating the root cause instead of patching symptoms. Instead of asking which quarterback can save us, they're confronting a more uncomfortable question: why don't quarterbacks survive here at all? That shift reframes everything. It suggests an awareness that chasing talent without repairing architecture is pointless, that player development doesn't happen in isolation, and that until the system itself is stable, philosophically, structurally, emotionally, even elite prospects are set up to fail. Once you accept that reality, another realization follows quickly. If the Browns' real issue was never talent, then fixing it won't come from another bold draft night or emergency hire. It will come from committing to a coherent vision and resisting the instinct to tear it down the moment things get uncomfortable. And that realization leads directly to the next layer of this story, because if Cleveland is finally thinking this way, then the kind of quarterback they're trying to appeal to has already changed. This is where the conversation gets delicate, and where most people rush too far ahead. This moment is not about landing a specific quarterback, it's about influence, and whether Cleveland realizes it or not, Shedeur Sanders has become one of the clearest signals of how that influence now works in modern football. Shedeur hasn't issued ultimatums, he hasn't named teams, he hasn't demanded outcomes. What he's done instead is more powerful. He's been transparent about standards. Over and over, he's emphasized that where a quarterback goes matters just as much as how high he's drafted. Development, stability, communication, a system that's designed to grow with you instead of forcing you to adapt every year. That mindset alone changes how organizations are evaluated. This isn't arrogance, it's awareness. Quarterbacks like Sanders have watched too many talented players walk into broken environments and carry the blame when the structure collapses. They've seen careers stall not because of ability, but because of dysfunction. As a result, the evaluation process is flipped. Teams are being scouted now, just as much as players are. That's why Cleveland's interest in a system-oriented candidate carries weight beyond any single draft scenario. It signals an understanding that attracting elite quarterback talent in today's NFL isn't about selling hope, it's about demonstrating competence, showing that development isn't a buzzword, but a built-in feature of the organization. And that's exactly the kind of thing Sanders has said he's watching for. It's important to be clear here. There's no confirmed connection, no back-channel deal, no guarantee that Cleveland ends up anywhere near Sanders on draft day. Framing it that way misses the point entirely. The real impact is philosophical. By even entertaining a coaching identity rooted in quarterback-first thinking, the Browns are speaking the language that modern prospects understand. Sanders represents a broader shift, a new generation of quarterbacks that values clarity over chaos and infrastructure over improvisation. They want to know who will be teaching them, how long that voice will be there, and whether mistakes are part of growth or a fast track to being replaced. Those questions used to come after teams drafted a player. Now they come before. And that's where this moment tightens. Cleveland doesn't have to be chasing Shedeur Sanders to be affected by him. His standards are already shaping what desirable looks like in the league. Teams that ignore that reality risk becoming irrelevant to the very players they want to build around. Teams that adapt, slowly, intentionally, change how they're perceived. This interview suggests Cleveland is at least aware of that shift. Acknowledging it doesn't mean they've solved anything. It means they've stopped pretending the old formulas still work. And in a league where quarterbacks hold more leverage than ever, that awareness is the first real test. Because once players like Sanders start watching how teams behave instead of what they promise, every decision becomes louder. And the next one Cleveland makes will say far more than any headline ever could. In the NFL, credibility isn't built through press releases or off-season promises. It's built through behavior, through patterns, through what a franchise does when no one is forcing their hand. That's why this interview quietly became a credibility check for the Cleveland Browns, not just in the eyes of fans, but across the league itself. Players, agents, and executives don't evaluate teams the way casual observers do. They read between the lines. They study hiring choices. They look at whether organizations follow through or flinch. And when Cleveland chose to seriously engage with a candidate whose philosophy challenges their historical instincts, it sent a message, not a guarantee, not a commitment, a signal that they might finally be aware of how their reputation was built and how it could be changed. This interview mattered because it forced Cleveland to reveal its priorities. Hiring a safe, familiar name would have required no explanation. Everyone would have shrugged and moved on. But bringing in a candidate rooted in long-term structure and quarterback development asked a harder internal question: are we willing to back a process even when it doesn't produce instant validation? That's the part franchises often avoid, because credibility only forms when vision survives pressure. The Browns have talked about alignment before, stability before, process before. What made this moment different is that it wasn't reactive. There was no public meltdown, no forced reset. This was a voluntary probe into a direction that demands patience and discipline. Around the league, that kind of move gets noticed, not for who it includes, but for who it excludes. It suggests Cleveland isn't just filling a vacancy, they're testing whether they can live with discomfort, whether they can resist the urge to chase headlines or lean on nostalgia when the moment gets heavy. And that's exactly how quarterback prospects and their camps evaluate seriousness. They don't listen to slogans, they track actions. If a team claims it values development but cycles leadership every 2 years, the message collapses. If a franchise talks about patience but fires coaches at the first downturn, the credibility is gone. This interview, by itself, doesn't solve that history, but it challenges it. What made it a check instead of a celebration is what comes next, because credibility isn't earned for considering change, it's earned for committing to it. If Cleveland follows this exploratory step with decisive, aligned action, the narrative shifts. If they retreat to comfort, the conclusion becomes obvious: nothing actually changed. That's why the stakes here are bigger than higher. This is about whether Cleveland understands that modern players, and especially quarterbacks, are watching how teams behave under uncertainty, whether they lean into conviction or fold under noise. This interview put the Browns on record, quietly, subtly, but unmistakably. And once that record exists, there's no hiding from the next decision. What Cleveland is circling right now isn't experimental, it isn't reckless, and it definitely isn't unique anymore. It's a blueprint the NFL has already started rewarding, one built on intentional design, coaching alignment, and quarterback-centric thinking. The difference is that some franchises, recognized it early, while others, like the Cleveland Browns, are only now deciding whether they're brave enough to commit to it. Across the league, the teams that made real jumps didn't do it by collecting stars or chasing the loudest names. They did it by empowering modern offensive thinkers and giving them room to build systems, not just install playbooks. Look at the Detroit Lions. Their rise wasn't powered by constant turnover or miracle moves. It was driven by philosophical clarity, staff continuity, and an offense built to evolve around its quarterback rather than restrict him. The same pattern shows up in Houston. The Houston Texans didn't reinvent football, they aligned it. Young coordinator, clear developmental plan, consistent messaging from the front office down to the locker room. The result wasn't instant dominance, but steady acceleration. The quarterback wasn't asked to save the franchise, he was supported by it. This is the blueprint Cleveland appears to be studying, a move away from reactionary decision-making toward intentional structure. In these successful models, coaching hires aren't isolated gambles, they're anchors. Everything, from draft strategy to weekly game planning, is filtered through the same lens. That's what creates stability, and stability is what allows talent to compound instead of reset. The league itself is forcing this evolution. Defenses are faster, disguises are sharper, pressure packages punish hesitation. The old model, where quarterbacks are dropped into rigid systems and told to adjust, no longer holds up. Modern offenses have to be adaptive. Quarterbacks have to be taught how to think, not just where to throw. That's why these newer coaching philosophies are winning. They assume chaos and design around it. Cleveland has tried to shortcut this before. Flashy acquisitions, emergency fixes, fragmented strategies. None of it stuck because none of it addressed the core issue: lack of coherence. The teams that are winning now don't chase fixes, they chase alignment. They understand that development doesn't happen in fragments. It happens when coaching, scouting, and leadership speak the same language. That's what makes this moment different. For the first time in years, Cleveland's reported interest aligns with what's actually working in the NFL, not what used to work. They're not inventing a future, they're catching up to one that's already here. But blueprints only matter if they're followed. Studying the model is easy, committing to it is where franchises get exposed. And the closer Cleveland gets to this version of itself, the louder the next question becomes. Will they trust the process long enough to let it work, or will fear pull them back to familiar ground? This is the part of the cycle where Cleveland has always flinched. Not at the beginning, not at the idea stage, but right here, when conviction starts to feel uncomfortable and patience stops producing instant applause. The Cleveland Browns don't usually fail because they choose the wrong direction. They fail because they abandon the direction the moment resistance shows up. The risk isn't hiring the wrong coach. The risk is retreating back to what feels safe. Familiar names, conventional resumes, philosophies everyone understands because they've been recycled for decades. When pressure rises, from media, from fans, from inside the building, the temptation is always the same. Default to comfort. Call it stability and sell it as experience. That's how progress quietly dies. Cleveland knows this pattern better than anyone. Moments where a pivot was possible, where a long-term vision was on the table, and then suddenly the organization blinked. A rough stretch sparked panic. A losing season reset the clock. Instead of insulating the plan, they tore it out by the roots. Every time that happened, the message to players was unmistakable. There is no runway here. That's what makes this moment dangerous, because once you signal awareness, once you acknowledge that structure, alignment, and quarterback development actually matter, you can't pretend you didn't. If Cleveland pivots now, if they explore modern thinking only to reject it at the moment of commitment, the damage goes beyond optics. It hardens the narrative that this franchise talks evolution but doesn't have the stomach for it. Around the league, that kind of behavior is logged. Agents remember, players remember, especially quarterbacks. Retreat doesn't look like caution to them, it looks like fear. And fear is the fastest way to lose credibility in a league where confidence and clarity define careers. The irony is that retreat often masquerades as responsibility, choosing the proven option, avoiding the risk. protecting the organization from scrutiny. But the NFL has already exposed that logic is outdated. The biggest risks now aren't in innovation, they're in stagnation, in pretending yesterday's solutions can survive today's game speed, complexity, and pressure. If Cleveland caves, the message will be clear. This was an exercise, not a transformation, a flirtation with change, not a commitment to it. And once that's revealed, every future pitch about patience and alignment becomes background noise. That's why the next move matters more than any interview ever could. Retreat wouldn't just waste a moment, it would confirm everything skeptics already believe. And for a franchise standing this close to rewriting its own story, that would be the most costly decision of all. When the noise settles and the names fade from the cycle, one truth remains. This was never about one coach, not about age, not about innovation buzz, not even about whether Grant Udinski ends up wearing a headset in Cleveland. This moment matters because it exposed something deeper, a question the Cleveland Browns have avoided for most of their modern existence. What kind of organization do they actually want to be? For years, Cleveland chased outcomes without protecting the process. Draft picks were supposed to save seasons. Coaches were expected to fix structural problems on impossible timelines. Quarterbacks were asked to carry dysfunction instead of being shielded from it. Every failure was treated as an isolated mistake rather than evidence of a broken system. That pattern created the reputation the Browns have spent decades trying to outrun. This interview changed the framing, not because it promised success, but because it acknowledged reality. That stability is built, not announced. That quarterback development requires architecture, not slogans. That credibility isn't earned in press conferences, it's earned through restraint, alignment, and follow-through. Those ideas aren't trendy anymore, they're necessary. And hovering over all of this, whether explicitly or not, is the standard being set by modern quarterbacks. Players like Shedeur Sanders represent a generation that evaluates franchises the way franchises used to evaluate players. They're paying attention to leadership behavior, developmental consistency, and institutional maturity. They're not looking to be saviors, they're looking to be supported. Cleveland doesn't have to draft Sanders for his influence to matter. His expectations already do. They force teams to confront a hard truth. If your structure is broken, elite talent will see it. If your vision collapses under pressure, they'll move on. And if you only flirt with change instead of committing to it, credibility evaporates. This is why what happens next defines more than a season. It defines whether Cleveland remains a cautionary tale or becomes a case study in growth. Following through doesn't guarantee wins, it guarantees something far rarer, a chance to build trust, to align leadership, to finally give quarterbacks an environment where development isn't a gamble. The Browns are standing at a fork they've reached before, but never taken. One path leads back to familiarity, short-term comfort, and eventual regret. The other requires patience, discipline, and the courage to let a vision breathe. This moment is quiet, it's fragile, and it won't wait. Because in the NFL, process without results becomes noise, but results without vision become burnout. Cleveland has a rare chance to choose neither, to choose something sustainable. And whether they do or don't will echo far beyond one hire, into how players see them, how fans trust them, and how history remembers this turning point.